Hello, my classical music lovers. Welcome back to Chords and Queens, the podcast where we dive deep into the lives of legendary female composers, especially the ones history tried to overlook. I'm your host, Jennifer Athen, and today we are talking about an absolute queen of American classical music, Florence Price. Now, if you haven't heard of her, buckle up, because this woman was an absolute force of nature. She was the first black woman to have a symphony performed by a major orchestra. Yeah, we're talking history-making levels of genius. And her music? For me, it's a blend of Hollywood Disney princess film scores with power and a bit of bite. It blends classical European traditions with the deep, soulful sounds of African American spirituals, and honestly, it slaps. But before we get into all of this, let's rewind the clock and start at the very beginning. Okay, it's April 9th, 1887 in Little Rock, Arkansas. And baby Florence Beatrice Smith is born into a family that's totally setting her up for greatness. Her mum, Florence Gulliver, is a school teacher and pianist, and her dad, James Smith, is a dentist. So education and ambition, very much a thing in the Smith household. And just to highlight as well, her dad was one of the only black dentists in America at the time, so what a backdrop to her early life. And on that point, let's take a moment to really gauge the time that this is all happening in, because in the United States, they're still confined and restricted by Jim Crow laws, which essentially just relied so much on segregation and hierarchy, and there's this constant white supremacy complex happening. Southern states passed laws to prevent African Americans from voting, and Jim Crow laws meant that there was segregation in public toilets, schools, parks, libraries, restaurants, and of course transportation. Lynching was also still very prominent and really targeted black males in particular. And this all dominated the American South for 3/4 of a century. I mean, this topic deserves its own separate podcast for just how horrific it must have been to endure. For all the opportunities presented to you being determined solely based on the colour of your skin is just all kinds of barbaric. And what's really sad is it's still happening today. I spend so much of my time researching the lives of female composers, but not only is gender the barrier in this case, race is as well. It's actually what makes me so upset that we don't teach stories like Florence Price's in schools. But on that tangent, let's get back to talking about Florence. So, as I mentioned, her mum was a really talented piano player in her own right, and it was her mum that basically became her first music teacher, or so it's believed, because not much is known about her early musical education, but it did appear she didn't always dream of life as a composer. Because initially, she actually wanted to study medicine. At the age of 14, she graduated high school, which to me seems crazy because I was probably still learning how to spell. And she decided to take a gap year before heading off to college and went to study at the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, which was a huge deal, especially for a young black woman in the early 1900s. At NEC, she studied composition with George Chadwick, who was kind of a big deal at the time. Definitely check him out. And she double majored in organ and piano performance with the intention that she might one day teach music. Oh, and also if you've listened to previous episodes of the podcast, you'll know who this is. Amy Beach was there. What a small world. The interesting thing was that there was actually many female students there already. This was probably because it was kind of acceptable for women to play musical instruments, especially the piano, and the general consensus was that women could write songs, and that was quite sweet, but no way were they composers. No thank you. On the topic of not quite fitting in, there is evidence that she actually put her hometown was in Mexico, perhaps to try to allude that she was from Mexico in order to try and distance herself from the segregation that came with being a black woman. But not a whole lot is known about why she did this, or if someone else perhaps told her to do so. There's some talk around that it may have been her mother, but I don't necessarily want to speculate, as there's no real documented explanation of why she did this, and She never did it again either, but perhaps this shows the lengths she was willing to go to follow her dreams and ambitions. Now, if you weren't already impressed with Florence's life so far, here's a fun fact. She was actually pursuing 2 degrees at the time and managed to finish both in just 3 years. And on top of this, managed to find time to study composition as well. To put it in perspective and give you some figures, the graduation percentage of that year was 3%, and she was actually the only student in her class to get 2 degrees. So say it with me, she was an icon. So after graduation, she bounces around teaching music, first in Arkansas, then in Atlanta, and eventually she settles back in Little Rock. And this is where she meets her husband, Thomas Price, in 1912, and they have 3 children, a son who unfortunately passed away in infancy, and 2 daughters, Florence and Edith. A lot of Florences going on in her life. Her husband Thomas was a lawyer, but she still continued to teach and compose music, but she was denied membership in the Arkansas State Music Teachers Association because of her race. Like, this is getting ridiculous now. And in 1927, after a white lynch mob brutally killed a black man named John Carter in Little Rock, Florence Price knew it was time to leave. She moved her family to Chicago to escape the rising racial violence. And just 2 years later, the Great Depression hit, making things even more difficult. So to keep her family afloat, she took on whatever musical work she could, teaching piano, playing the organ, and even composing catchy jingles for radio ads and accompanied silent films. In late 1929, her husband lost his job and started to grow angry and abuse her. In February of 1930, he actually pulled a gun on her. She escaped, thankfully, unharmed, to her friend's house. But Price refused to stay in a toxic situation, and she made the bold choice to divorce him and raise their 2 children on her own. But she had no set income and 2 kids to feed. A month after her divorce, she then remarried. But enough about her love life for a second. She then began work on her symphony in E minor that she submitted to the Rodman Wanamaker contest for music for black composers. With $1,000 on offer, she won $750 by placing first in symphony and the solo piano composition categories, which, to put it in perspective, is worth $14,500 in today's money. The remaining winnings actually went to Marjorie Bonds, who was a former student of Florence's, which I think really must highlight what a great teacher you are if you yourself are winning the main prize and then your student wins the remainder. So let's get into a bit more detail about this symphony then, because let's be honest, it's a big deal. It's not just a symphony, it's a statement. When she composed it, she was in her early 40s, living in Chicago and already grinding through life as a single mother and a composer. But this symphony was a game changer. Like I briefly mentioned earlier, in 1932, Price entered the symphony into the prestigious Wanamaker competition in Philadelphia, which was a major deal back then. Not only did she win, but her symphony became the first work by an African-American woman to ever be performed by a major orchestra. And she wasn't alone in this endeavor. The black community of that time really rallied around her, and there's these stories of them even helping with copying out the symphony for its premiere, which is just such a beautiful thing. It just makes me feel better that she did have support and community around her. The symphony itself is a perfect blend of European classical traditions and African American musical elements. In terms of form, it's structured like a traditional 4-movement symphony, with everything from the sweeping dramatic opening to the more lyrical second movement. But what sets it apart is how Price weaves in these powerful African-American spirituals, folk melodies, and rhythms that make the piece stand out in a way that no one was really doing at the time. And ironically, the opening piece on this program was an overture written by white supremacist John Powell, who founded a society that thought it was the elitist KKK. And I just want to know what was going through her head at the time. Was it rage? Was it a big F you? Was it both? And I hate that I'll never know. Because imagine your symphony is being premiered, but the piece just before it is by a white supremacist. crazy. But anyway, let's dive into the symphony. The first movement starts with this big, bold, almost cinematic energy that grabs you right away. The strings carry a lot of the tension in this section, and the brass has this commanding, regal presence. It feels grand, like you're building up to something huge. But within all of that, Price subtly infuses some bluesy, soulful moments that give the piece that sense of depth and emotional complexity. The second movement. This is where we really start to see Florence's brilliance in blending classical sophistication with heartfelt emotional expression. The second movement is slow and mournful, and there's this moment of breathtaking tenderness where the strings sing these long, aching melodies. But then you hear Price's voice come through, adding in these little hints of black folk traditions that make the movement feel so uniquely hers. It's as though the symphony goes from this universal, deeply personal, sort of like offering both introspection and hope. The third movement. Now, the third movement, this is where things get really interesting. It's a really fun, upbeat, energetic movement that's all about rhythm and pulse. Juba dance is a direct reference to a kind of African American folk dance, and it's a nod to Price's roots and the African American cultural experience. The rhythm is infectious, and the music feels like it's alive, moving, and full of vitality. It's playful, but there's also this underlying intensity, like the music is celebrating freedom and resilience. The fourth movement and the finale. The last movement brings the symphony sort of full circle, ending on a high, triumphant note. It's filled with all the grandeur you'd expect from a final movement, but again, Florence Price does something different. She includes motifs and themes that recall African American spirituals. It's like she's telling the story of struggle and triumph and wrapping up this monumental journey in a way that feels both celebratory and deeply reflective. Let's talk about the cultural impacts of this. When Price's symphony premiered with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra in 1933, it was a big deal, especially given the racial climate of the time. Florence Price was not only breaking barriers for black musicians, but also for women composers. For years, symphonic music had been dominated by European traditions and the quote-unquote greats like Beethoven, Brahms, and Tchaikovsky. So here comes Florence Price, who refuses to fit into any of those little neat boxes. Instead, she's bringing something entirely new, fusing classical structures with the music of her heritage. And let's be real, the work wasn't just a one-off. It's an introduction to Price's unique voice. As much as it was a victory for Price as an individual, it was a monumental moment for black musicians and composers everywhere, showing that their voices and experiences were worth celebrating in the concert hall, and they deserved a seat at the friggin' table. Today, the work is more than just a relic of a past time. It's relevant. In a world where we're constantly re-evaluating the canon of classical music and recognizing the need for diversity and inclusion, Price's symphonies, and this one in particular, are receiving the recognition they deserve. Major orchestras are revisiting and performing her works, and each time they do, it's a reminder that Price's genius was never really gone. She was just waiting for her moment in the spotlight. Now back to her life. At that time, she also worked for a radio station, WGN Radio, as a freelancer arranging tunes for Louis White, who was a singer who had his own radio show but had to keep his race a secret. In terms of her other musical works that she wrote and worked on, unfortunately, a lot of it's currently lost. For example, only one page of her second symphony was found, which is just so tragic to me. Eventually, a number of Price's works that were thought to be lost were actually found in an abandoned house. This house was actually her summer house for a while, and these papers were given to the archives of the University of Arkansas. Their rediscovery caused a huge surge in wanting to know more about Florence's work. But anyway, meanwhile, in her life at the time, she was trying to get her work protected by copyright because she applied to ASCAP or ASCAP, but needed a sponsor to do so. And that sponsor was John Alden Carpenter to help her, which eventually led to her getting her work sort of protected under copyright, but it took 6 years. This relationship was mutually beneficial though, as he used her connection to singer Marianne Anderson to widen his own reach to a national audience. But our girl, she was never very good at self-promotion, and her daughter actually played a big part in trying to promote her mother's work. And she still faced so many barriers. She wrote letters to famous conductors, basically begging them to perform her work, and a lot of them just left her on red and didn't reply. Because, you know, racism and sexism. But she never stopped composing. But this meant that a lot of her work's performances were local. In 1941, her and her daughter moved to Chicago Abraham Lincoln Center, which was a group home for mid to low income artists. The building featured an auditorium open to the public where concerts were performed, and during this time she taught a lot of piano students. But before we talk about the later period of her life, I wanted to come back to one of her many songs that she had written, and it's called Travel's End. It's an undated song, and its lyrics are actually from a poem by Mary Fowle Hoisington. Although I did come across a comment from her great-grandchild that actually mentioned that the poet actually went by May and it was misprinted to Mary. So words by May Fowle Hoisington? But anyway, it's a beautiful song which I want to play for you here on the podcast. Now this recording is by the incredibly talented soprano Hélène Lindqvist and Philipp Vogler, a pianist, conductor, composer, and professor at the University of Music in Munich, Germany. Now, they have this brilliant website called the Art Song Project, which essentially allows you to listen to their growing collection of rare and delightful art songs that they've brought to life. They even mention that the songs are recorded in one take in order to capture the live feeling, and oh boy, do they achieve that. So definitely check out more from the Art Song Project, and I'll make sure to leave this links below. But here's the performance of Travel's End by Florence Price. Isn't that just wonderful? Listening to Travel's End, you can't help but feel a sense of nostalgia and reflection. It's a song about endings, but not necessarily in a tragic way. There's a quiet acceptance in the music and a sense of finding rest after a long journey. The vocal melody in Travel's End is simple, but so deeply expressive. Price had a way of writing for the human voice that felt natural and intimate. She knew how to make a melody really speak. The rising and falling phrases create a sense of yearning, as if the singer is reaching for something just beyond their grasp. And the piano accompaniment isn't just background either, it plays an integral role in shaping the emotional arc of the song. Price often uses lush, impressionistic harmonies, and in Travel's End, you can hear how the piano supports the voice with these rolling arpeggios and shifting harmonic colors. She moves seamlessly between major and minor tonalities, reflecting this bittersweet nature of the song's theme. Is this journey an ending or a beginning? Some have interpreted it as a metaphor for death, while others see it as simply marking the end of a chapter in life. Either way, it's one of those songs that stays with you for a long time after the last note fades. So again, thank you so much to the Art Song Project for allowing me to share this with you. Throughout all the challenges that life threw at her though, she never stopped writing music. Another big moment for Florence was when her works were performed at the Lincoln Memorial Concert in 1939. The concert happened because of just blatant racism. The world-famous contralto Marian Anderson was supposed to perform at the Constitutional Hall in Washington, D.C., but the Daughters of the American Revolution, or the DAR, who controlled the venue, refused to let her sing there because she was black. Now, this sparked national outrage, and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt stepped in, helping to organize an alternative concert. That concert ended up being held outdoors at the Lincoln Memorial on April 9th, 1939, and it drew a massive audience of over 75,000 people, including political leaders, civil rights activists, and everyday Americans. And what did Marian Anderson sing that day? Among her selections was Florence Price's arrangement of My Soul's Been Anchored in the Lord. This piece is one of Price's most powerful arrangements of the African American spiritual. While traditional spirituals had been passed down orally for generations, Price, like many black composers of her time, arranged them in a way that preserved their raw emotional depth while also combining them into the classical music world. In Price's setting of My Soul's Been Anchored in the Lord, you can hear her signature style, rich harmonies, dramatic dynamics, and a deep connection to the roots of Black American music. The song is both prayerful and triumphant, and its message about standing firm in faith despite life struggles made it the perfect choice for that historic performance. In early 1951, Florence Price got a telegram from Sir John Barabaroli, who had learned about her work during this time as the music director of the New York Philharmonic. He invited her to compose a concert overture based on Black American spirituals for his current orchestra, the Halle Orchestra in Manchester, England. So, big deal. Her work was going international, right? Price accepted the opportunity and wrote an overture. Though the score has since been lost, Barabaroli premiered the piece in spring 1951, but unfortunately Price was hospitalized at the time and couldn't travel to attend the performance. She suffered from heart problems, and because of this, often had frequent hospitalizations during this time. It was only just 2 years later, in 1953, she passed away from a stroke in Chicago at the age of 66. She kept writing until her passing in 1953, leaving behind over 300 compositions, many of which weren't even discovered until 2009. Yeah, someone literally found a treasure trove of her lost works in an abandoned house in Illinois, which is wild. And now the world is finally giving her the recognition she always deserved. Major orchestras are programming her symphonies, her works are being recorded, and musicians everywhere are realizing Florence Price wasn't just important, she was brilliant. The one thing I did want to say as we wrap up this episode is that Florence was so determined that she wanted her work to speak for itself. She didn't want pity or to be known simply as a female composer or female writer of songs or a black female composer. She wanted the work to be judged solely on its substance and contents and not by the person writing the notes. And I think that's something that really resonates with me because I know I have a podcast solely focused on showcasing the work of female composers, but their works are amazing and brilliant. and it's so sad that it's been overlooked or dismissed for so many years, solely because of the gender or the race of the person who wrote the works. And Florence's story is just nothing short of incredible, not just for what she had to endure and go through, but how hard she worked and the dedication and drive she had simply to create good music, and that followed her throughout her whole life. And on that note, it's been an absolute pleasure getting to dive into her life with you, and I hope you've learned more about this absolute icon and queen of music. Again, I would also like to thank the Art Project for allowing me to share their recording of Travel's End with you, and please do check them out. If you made it this far, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.